Okay. So I've been listening to your videos on YouTube now for about 2 years. And for the past 6, 7 years of my life, I've been up and down on where like I fall in belief of whether or not just atheism or whether or not there's anything more particular to life. Whether, I don't like using the term metaphysical, whatever, something spiritual, like, is there an afterlife? Is this all I delve now more towards simulation theory, um, which I was gonna inquire like what your thoughts are on that,
Yeah,
but
not good.
you don't like you don't care for it.
No, no, I would say it's much worse than that. I mean, we have some very complex descriptions for example, how vision works.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for how our olfactory senses work, how your ears work, the vibrations through the atmosphere, and all of these depend on atoms existing.
Mm-hmm.
And so people want to pretend that everything is an illusion. There are no atoms, that we're actually just brains in vats or something grossly equivalent to that. And I imagine, why would you want to worship a God that is so deceptive, that creates this artificial reality and then doesn't even let you realize that you're just perceiving the artificial reality as it is? This God wants you to think that there are competent explanations for why vision works and why hearing works, and then also how to correct illnesses in those areas, how to correct defective hearing and improve eyesight and everything, all of which requires that there be atoms. And look at chemists, for example. I mean, if we want to pretend that everything is, we're just living in the matrix, then just tell chemists that their jobs are complete waste of time, that
Well,
everything is just an illusion.
the way I think of simulation theory is like usually a simulation holds some sort of purpose, usually to help us find answers to problems that we can't figure out for ourselves.
Okay.
And so like what am I like so if there was some sort of species out there that was capable of building such a complex simulation like our own, maybe the lack of involvement with it is just to let it happen its own natural course. And because at the end of the day it's a simulation. The thing I have to think about is like when we play a video game, that video game, the physics in it can be whatever you want them to be, whether you're playing World of Warcraft, the Elder Scrolls. So not, I mean, so our, so in that regard, they don't necessarily, reflect the real world. One of my thoughts on it, and I understand like the arguments against solipsism, we don't know what is real, what is not,
And that there's not
that
an
being a
argument for it.
false, yeah.
I mean,
So like,
the best you can say for solipsism is that it's one of those arguments that was designed to be such that you can't prove it wrong. Okay,
mm-hmm.
that's its only strength. There's nothing to indicate that it's right, and there would be no value in it being right. It's completely without point or purpose. It's just so that it's just one more excuse so that we can deny realities that we don't like.
Yeah, the way I look at solipsism, I on and off since I decided to leave Christianity. I've been looking into other religions. I started delving into the lectures of Alan Watts and him talking about like Taoism, Zen Buddhism, and the concept of non-duality. And the thing that I came to realize when looking at it, and because like Eastern philosophy is so radically different from like Western religions, it took me a moment to realize like the point of a Zen koan is just to get a person to stop asking questions and just to live in the moment. So like it doesn't really matter whether or not anything's real or not real, because if I walk in front of a car and that car, instead of killing me, just really injures me, I'm still going to have to live my life with that painful injury, regardless of whether or not it's real or not. So like right by that, I mean, just by that logic alone, you can dismiss solipsism. So like, what's the point then? Like you still got to live throughout it. What's the point of this philosophy other than just to kind of make a person think more outside of the box? But
I never had a problem thinking outside of the box. It's just that some postulations don't work, and so I mean, like
yeah.
we would expect that the just as we would expect an efficient simplicity to be a marker of intelligent design. People think the very opposite, that when it's unnecessarily, absurdly complex, this is an indicator that it was a non-conscious, haphazard configuration without intent. But people misinterpret that. I mean, exactly the opposite of what it should be.
Yeah. No, I think of it's more along as something like, because what finally got me to finally realize Christianity wasn't for me, because I've always been, even at a young age, on and off with, like, do I really think there's a God? Like, I sit there and I pray, Jesus, Book of Matthew, seek and ye shall find, ask you'll be given, knock the door to be, made open. And if the Father doesn't answer the first time you come knocking, you got to keep coming knocking and knocking and knocking again until he does answer. And that parable about that guy that wanted some loaf of bread or whatever. But like, here it is, like 19 years later, 20 years later, and still nothing. Like, you can't expect somebody to continue believing in that with, everybody else claiming to have experiences, but you're sitting there like, okay, why am I the one left hanging? So like a friend of mine, was beginning to just ask me questions where like, just to get me to toy with the idea of like, well, what if things were meant to be interpreted a bit differently? And that led me eventually down the road, like, something is off when it comes to the philosophy, when it comes to the theology behind Christianity. And I think in some cases that was maybe that was what it was meant for. Something stuck in my mouth.
Yeah, and I want to apologize for background noise too. I have a great hearings here that is making weird noises with his face because he knows I'm broadcasting.
A dog on a podcast for me is always a welcoming thing. Dogs are adorable.
Okay.
And you see, like, questions like that in that regard, just to challenge a person whose world is like really small, or they've only been exposed to certain things. Maybe like you said, like you, for example, you said that you didn't need that, maybe for other people. But, myself, that was certainly beneficial. So, like, I've been listening to your podcast, and you were talking about first you're a Christian, Mormon, from what I understand. And then you went from there. Go ahead.
Technically. I mean, I was baptized into the Mormon faith, but I never identified as Mormon, at least not to my memory.
So you went from there, you went to some form of paganism, and then eventually, after many years, you went on to, atheism. I just listened to a couple of your interviews, one with this guy named Matthew, and then one with somebody else. But the listening to him, you were kind of going a bit into that. What was that transition like for you? Like,
which transition from Christianity or Mormonism to
from there into paganism, then from like paganism on into atheism.
Well, it was a very brief transition. I mean, I did the Young Earth Christian thing as directed by a friend of mine who then later became a Southern Baptist minister. And my whole issue with that was that when you declare Jesus as your savior and everything, there's with any ritual really, there's a certain kind of an emotional attachment to that. And so I remember wandering around in elated daze for like a couple of hours before I kind of came to my senses and asked my friend, how do I know that this weird euphoria that I'm feeling is really the power of Jesus, and that it's not just something that I'm producing in my mind? How do I know this is real? Mm-hmm. And believers don't ever want to ask, how do I know if this is real? So he grabbed me by both shoulders and told me that to just keep telling myself it's Jesus until I believe it.
Yeah.
Which to me was overtly lying. And he had later, in his ministry, he had confessed to me that he was a strong advocate of fake it till you make it. Keep lying to yourself until you believe it.
Yeah, and I always found it interesting because I never had that. Like, even at the age of 4, I remember sitting at like some large church. There's some sort of event. I can't remember if it was like a Christmas pageant or whatever. But there's always that thing like at the end of them where they're like, well, if you haven't accepted Christ, blah, 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 well, if you do this prayer, and everybody's like always talking about like, after I did that prayer, there was this moment of like realizing Jesus or like this feeling of euphoria or whatever. I'm like, why don't I have that? Right. And but it wasn't until I was 20 that, and I left it behind, that I came across this internet practice called Tulpamancy, if you're familiar with it.
I'm not.
So Tulpamancy is a really interesting practice that is derived from Tibetan Buddhism traditionally. And the idea is like in Buddhism, this is a way like to get over phobias. It's a way to kind of experiment with the mind and its capacity. But it's, you're basically making an imaginary friend that you meditate on a daily basis. The way the internet does it today, like you'll write down a list of personality traits and you will try to meditate on that tulpa. Like you create like an image in your head of what you want it to look like, and you're trying to force your brain into tricking itself into seeing it as if like you're looking at the computer in front of you. And I'm sitting there at first when I came across it, I'm like, oh, well, that sounds like demon possession. I'm like, wait, I'm no longer Christian. I don't believe in that. And from what everybody says, like if you, whenever you decide like you're done with the tulpa, whatever, you know, it goes away after a couple of days. I'm like, well, that doesn't sound like demon possession at all. So I'm like, okay, I'm trying it out. But as I tried it out for over the year, the results varied. Where like there's this idea like, okay, well, if you're sitting, because you got to sit there and you got to talk to it every day, right? And like the more you talk with it, eventually there's supposed to be a point where you might like have a thought pop up that seems a little bit foreign to you. So like if you have to ask like, was that me or was that my tulpa, the idea is supposed to say, well, let the tulpa decide if it was itself or not. But I'm sitting there, I'm thinking about it later, I'm like, that kind of feels to me like what Christianity is or what religion is. You're trying to you're tricking your brain into believing in something. You got this religious text that gives a set of personality traits that it might possess, you know, because one book says God's like this, another book God's like that. I mean, God is described some other way, whatever. So you just pick what works for you. And then over time, like you start having these experiences. I'm like, well, that's curious. But then I also came to realize, like, well, if Tulpamancy wasn't working for me, then no wonder I wasn't having any sort of these religious experiences that people were claiming to have. Which, and then later on, like I started seeing videos about like some people's, you know, don't have an inner monologue. Some people can't visualize their brain, and like I'd never thought of that before. I'm like, kind of realizing like maybe that's why, you know, so many people in part like question like how, I mean, aren't prone to religion or something. Like at least myself. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit.
But all right.
But like for me at this point, it's been like I definitely want to go more atheist, but there's still a part of me like holding on to like the desire for something. And it's weird for me because like I know like that's irrational. So why did I find a part of myself, you know, trying to cling to that? Initially, I was going to ask like if you had the same thing. And I was listening to your one podcast with that guy Matthew, I think was his name, and you're talking about like after you called up that one TV show that was like talking about the paranormal, and they said like, oh, it was all for entertainment, like you were done with it. So like that seemed for somebody to be that transition into like, okay, I'm done with it, and no second thoughts, or like were there any second thoughts? And if there wasn't, that seems like a bit, you know, alien to my experience.
Were there any second thoughts? I mean, yeah. I mean, when I realized that my friend was lying to me, and that he was in fact lying to himself, and that by implication Christianity was just a lie in general, I didn't believe in Christianity anymore, but I wasn't absolutely certain of it. I mean, I had to evaluate, and is there a God at all? Why would I assume, if there was a God, why would I assume that it would be the Christian God? You know, because I should have never put those two things in the same box.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, you know, people have, I saw a poll yesterday on Facebook where, you know, have you, what is your reason for not accepting God? And all of the answers were stupid. It was like, no atheist would ever answer these questions that they posed, you know, that that I'm atheist because it's good for my conscience, because I just want to sin, that kind of crap.
Hmm.
Or one of the answers was because I haven't read the Quran yet. So I'm an atheist because I haven't read the Quran yet? Damn.
You can sit there there's so many people that can sit there, read the Quran, and come back saying this is nonsense. Why would anybody believe that? It doesn't make.
That's my experience, yeah.
Yeah, no, like, why would that even be a question? Clearly, whoever made that post had some sort of like bias towards some agenda to prove some sort of nonsense or something. I don't know. I could be wrong, but that's what it would feel like to me. No, like, I don't know. It's just weird feeling, continuing to feel that pulse to still want to believe in something. And like, how do other people cope with that? For myself, like, the idea of the Christian God ended once, it's not something that I'm necessarily proud of, but at the same time not necessarily ashamed of, because it did help me a lot with officially breaking off from Christianity, but was taking psychedelics. Because, well, it wasn't any psychedelic. It was like Amanita muscaria, that red mushroom with the white spots that just so happens to be decorated up and down like so many cathedrals, which opened up new questions to me after realizing the early church had a history with psychedelics. And you start getting into that topic, like, what if Jesus was a code word for mushrooms? Or like, what if communion initially involved some sort of psychedelic brew that some Greek cults were already consuming at the time?
But there's a lot of spirituality that is connected to narcotics.
Yeah.
Eastern religions have a tight connection with opiates, and
Mm-hmm.
these are all and peyote for the Native Americans.
Yeah.
These were all supposed to be mind expanding. So they think they're seeing into the supernatural world, which is, what is the supernatural world but a world of magic, where the laws of physics don't make sense. So of course, if they didn't understand the laws of physics to begin with, then of course they think that these drugs are opening their third nostril receptor so that they can see into that spiritual realm.
That's what I had to come to terms with, because I was like wrestling with like, okay, how much of my experiences with psychedelics are real, how much of them aren't. And what I came to realize is that there's no new information that these substances are introducing you to. All it seems to do, from my personal experience, is to take what you've already been pre-exposed to, and because of the way that it changes the way your brain processes information, it makes it feel as if you've come across something new, or it pieces it together in such a way that it feels like you've had like an expansion in your perception on, like, well, maybe if this here wasn't the proper way to look at Jesus, maybe this other perception is. And I've, sitting there like wrestling with that, because like it's helped with mental health, with my mental health, whatever. Because like a crisis of faith, especially after what led it for me really questioning God to begin with, was that, growing up, my background wasn't that healthy. Especially living with my father, he had more of a jailhouse faith. For him, it was something to help him get through whatever struggle he's going with. But then he always goes back off to, whether doing robbery, doing drugs or whatever. So I'm like, this doesn't really, like, it. What was I saying? My apologies. I've lost my train of thought. My mind's a bit. I only woke up like a little while ago. But I'm sitting there, I'm like, maybe it was, like, people should be wary when it comes to psychedelics, when it comes to that. So my mind on that's kind of changed. But I look at, the relationships that computers, specifically, the computer industry and people using psychedelics. I looked at Christianity. I'm like, there's no way this religion is meant to, it's not meant to really address these subjects. And like, this is the first real experience that I'm having. Why is that? Or at least it's more real than, any experience that I was led to believe I was supposed to have as a Christian, which is what caught my interest. I apologize. My mind's a bit more scattered than, a little bit right now than what it was. I was just with some family a little bit ago, up to when this message, when we started this chat, it's like I was kind of focused in that mindset. It takes me a little while to kind of think ahead.
No need to apologize.
Yeah. So, but listening to your podcast, I started getting into like, well, the Hebrews were originally Canaanites. If that theory is correct, then at the very least it's and there's a lot of evidence that they've taken from other religions. Because I'm not going to college or whatever, I've been trying to do my own, studying on like what the true origin of the Bible is. In your video, the evolution of the Book of Genesis helped put that better together. Like I was aware of Lilith, I was aware like she came from the like her different influence in Hebrew, but that she also came from other religions, and then something doing with the story of Gilgamesh. But like I've read the Epic of Gilgamesh, I'm like I couldn't find reference to Lilith. Like maybe there's another, if there's like other sets of texts about him, whatever.
With so many religious things, there's subtle implications in how you read it,
Mm-hmm.
and I hate that this is the explanation that I'm given, but with Lilith, I think her name was Lilitu, or it was that the tree that she was in was the Hippolyte tree. But it was in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There is Lilith or Lilitu, who lives in this tree. She lives in the. I can't remember what was special about the tree, but it obviously, the tree that she lived in ended up being the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and she lived in this tree with the serpent who could not be tamed, and of course
Mm-hmm.
that was later turned into the serpent who convinced Eve to eat the forbidden fruit and all that. And then the concept of the forbidden fruit, as you know, came from another collection of myths. But where Lilith comes from is like there's not a hard explicit legend about that. It's like if you go to the Talmudic legends, there are references to that rabbis were saying at once upon a time that Lilith was the first wife, that she was equal to Adam. They were both created at the same time, and that Adam wanted to be dominant. He wanted to be on top during sex.
Yeah, I'm
And
familiar with that. I just, like going a little bit on the internet, Wikipedia gives some sort of background to it. Babylon had their own myth, a couple other cultures around them had it. But like, I guess because there's only so far that you can go without getting a formal education, finding your channel is very helpful with that. Like I've been talking with my family about it, and I'm trying to get like, okay, well, Eve was the harlot, Adam was Enkidu, trying to work that in with it, as well as like which culture does it stem from. But the more that I began just looking into, the more like this entire different portrait of how history has developed for humanity. And it, like I used to listen to like my father used to have us listen to hours worth of Kent Hovid's
oh my
content
gosh,
on a daily basis, and all of his explanations of like, oh yeah, we know the story of Adam and Eve is true because there was some vase with the depiction of Gilgamesh and Eve under this tree with a serpent in it. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting, but he doesn't go into say like, okay, that wasn't actually Eve, that was Lilith, whatever. So now the more that I've begun looking into, and I've started like finding like, oh wait, that's where that's coming from, whatever. And this here, like, like they say, like Moses wrote the wrote the Bible, wrote the Torah, whatever.
the
Okay, well,
Pentateuch,
that's not in, yeah, the
the first
Pentateuch, like
five, yeah.
that's not even in the Bible. Other than maybe if you look up at the top of the opening of the book in the KJV, it says written by Moses, but nowhere's in the Old Testament does it credit Moses. So like, where does that come from? Apparently, I have to, somebody might want to fact check me on it, but apparently it comes from the Rabbinical Talmud. But now but like, if I remember correctly, the Rabbinical Talmud also says like the book of Job's the oldest book. But like, so I don't know, the whole thing, like the context of when different events of the Bible are supposed to happen just starts falling out of place the more you look at it. And I'm like, history, I guess, like if you're not going to a university, is a bit hard to make sense out of. Like for a while, like I'm sitting there, I'm looking at this deity that the Bible calls Baal. I'm realizing that Baal simply means Lord, and that there was a correction in the Book of Deuteronomy from saying Baal to the Baals, to like there's a multiple set of deities simply referred to as Baal, and that's wasn't and that Yahweh might have, or Baal might have been, you know, an iteration of Yahwehism or whatever. So I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. I look at the Baal cycle. I'm like, okay, here's a God with a sky father. Here's Jesus, who also has a sky father. Both of them overcome death. Both of them replace their father. If Yahweh was an iteration of Baal, or if the two, you know, have the same origin, then that would make sense to me, like that Jesus had some amount of influence from that mythology. People
Yeah,
have corrected me on that, saying that.
Jesus comes from a number of different things. We can't go back all the way back to the Ugarit faith and assume that was the sole inspiration for Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus seems obviously a compilation of a number of different things. Like he was an appropriation of John the Baptist. So John the Baptist already had a following, and he was appropriated, so that there's this story that was made up that John the Baptist then baptizes Jesus, and then tells his own followers that they should now follow Jesus from now on. And the Muslims did the same thing. There was a Persian bit of folklore, and I can't remember the name of it. I read it years ago, that talked about how there was a guy who was a pilgrim from Zoroastrianism, who in 1200 or so CE goes into Saudi Arabia or whatever, and seeks out Jesus, and he finds Jesus, because in Islam Jesus was never crucified, never died. He still every day comes outside and performs miracles on people, or at least he did for centuries. And so this guy comes and meets Jesus, and Jesus tells him that he is, you know, he has all these mystical powers and everything, and he was created by God directly, you know, through a union of the Spirit of God with Mary. But he says that he is not the final prophet, that Muhammad is the final prophet, and you should now follow him instead of Jesus. So these are the ways that people take somebody who already has a religious following, and you appropriate that to redirect to your new following that you want to create.
Yeah, no, like I was definitely, like, I've heard people say here and there, like Jesus is based off a horse. I know that is bullocks, but like other different religions, one of the
Yeah, I never
videos you have on
understood
your
the Horus
channel.
thing. I never read the Book of the Dead. It's amazing that I never did. But I never got that. I mean, I've heard random people say that Jesus was based on Horus, but it never appeared to be. Not
No, from what I understand, it was one woman that started this. And like she greatly misconstrued it and twisted the entire story of Horus. You know, born in a cave, not in a, you know, manger somewhere, born in a swamp. His mother, you know, had to take her dead husband's genitals to impregnate herself. Like, okay, so there goes being a virgin birth. But when you get people that, you know, just want to so heavily disprove a religion, anything that seems to work or could be misconstrued, or like with a little bit of twisting could work on their behalf, they're going to do that. You know,
Yeah, seemingly.
Kent Hovind does, you know, Kent Hovind with the whole like, oh, Epic of Gilgamesh, therefore Book of Genesis has to be truth. I can't stand that guy. I got to go over your video series on like you go over like the history of like evolution, like different species, whatever. But, you know, I've been listening to, you know, more educational podcasts, PBS Space Time, when I want to get into subject about quantum physics. Because like for a while, you know, I've been into the idea of the paranormal. I've been looking into different spiritualities, and like everybody talks about, like, well, consciousness influences, you know, how the wave function expresses itself in the real world. And, you know, Heisenberg and these other founders of quantum physics, would go about saying that as well. So why have people changed it? Well, so like listening to PBS Spacetime, and they sit there, they address that issue. Like Heisenberg and the other physicists that came to that conclusion would later on come back saying, no, consciousness is a benefactor of whatever the mechanism is. That sometime between when the results are being displayed on the computer and when your eyes pick up on the photons that are giving you the feedback for what's being displayed on the computer, that transition from just being a possible expression of the wave function to the way that it is now expressing itself it takes some time it happens sometime between there. So like there's so much pseudoscience out there. And then I was just discussing with somebody, like, I've been watching PBS Spacetime just long enough to become familiar enough with some terms to realize I have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah.
It's that weird and abstract that it's so easy to misconstrue. And that for me was what began, like, okay, maybe spirituality isn't as much spiritual as it is just a mental thing. Like when people go in for tarot card readings, like, is a tarot card reading actually prophetic, or are the cards just vague enough? Like, here's the lovers, this is what the lovers, here's the any of these 5 situations that the lovers card could cover, but the descriptions of each situation is vague enough that it can represent just about anything you want. So, like, maybe it's less actually spiritual and just more of a way for a person who's too emotionally invested in a situation to properly think clearly, to force themselves to kind of like take a step outside of the situation.
Yeah, you remind me. There's a psychic about a mile from my house, and I've been meaning for more than a year to go in and get a reading, on the condition that I'm allowed to record it, of course.
I could do one for you.
Well, yeah,
if you want.
That's no fun. I want somebody who's advertising that they're a psychic. I want to walk in and get a psychic reading and have it be on video and just see how interesting that might be.
So, like, I got to be careful because my family members are extremely religious and they would lose it because I think some of them are still here. But, like, I do tarot card readings and I've been doing it for fun to, like, is there any amount of truth to them? And it's still something I do for hobby. Like, I was in different groups because, like, okay, I walk away from Christianity. I want to learn what magic is. Because ever since I was a young child, I knew, like, if Christianity to work out for me, my path would lead down towards magic, magic, whatever. But I'm sitting there, I'm thinking about, like, okay, well, which cult is it that I want to look into? Because as far as I'm concerned, there's too much discrepancies within Wicca. Whatever, everybody treats Wicca way too differently. There's
that was my problem with Wicca also.
Yeah. The New Age movement, I started off initially with the New Age movement until I began to, okay, well, they're talking about the chakras and Kundalini and Buddhism and meditation.
Well, I want to see. Isn't it anymore? Because that's entirely too Eastern.
Yeah. And that's why I began to realize, like, I'm not going to listen to somebody who's not raised in that culture to sit there and tell me what that culture is about. I had that problem with Christianity, like and Judaism. Like, they claim to speak, oh, this is what this Jewish holiday or this Jewish practice is about. And then you sit there and you listen to an actual rabbi and, like, you guys got it totally wrong. You guys don't even worship the same God as us. You guys don't even understand why you don't worship the same God as us. But when it comes to our sacred texts, like the Zohar or the rabbinical Talmud, you want to tell everybody, no, that's demonic. And, like, you guys don't even know our own history. How can you claim to speak about what our God or beliefs are? And that was my issue.
One of my spiritual leaders as a young man was a kid who at 15 had gotten some ordination to be a Druidic priest. And I, being a teenager myself, didn't realize that nobody knows what the Druids believed.
No, nobody does. And that was my thing, like, with these, revived, historic Western religions. Like, the Catholics and Protestants went so far out of their way to rid Europe of these mythologies and these practices that there's no way we can have any idea of how our ancestors practiced them. So, like, I'm sitting there, I'm like, okay, well, what's the next best thing that's, popular enough in America? So I started looking into Hoodoo and Haitian voodoo, which, interestingly enough, their history revolves around spiritual warfare. When we started enslaving people in Africa, bringing them over to Haiti and into America, that they would readapt their shamanistic practices for spiritual warfare against the people that enslaved them. And I'm like, if there's any religion here in the West that's going to be, outside of the Native Americans, that's going to be, really close to their origins, it's going to be that. So, that is what I want to look into. But when I was in these groups, what I came to realize is most of these people have some sort of mental health issue. They lack a great deal of common sense. Like, there's so many of them that, like, want a love reading or want a love spell done in order to keep their abusive boyfriend who cheats on them from cheating on them. Like, why would you want to go back to that? Like, And it's funny because like I'm listening to this Haitian Bokor, which is a type of Haitian voodoo priest that dabbles more in the black magic aspect of voodoo. Yeah, sorry if my screen's jumbling around. Um, and like this guy, openly talks about, it's like, dude, there are so many of you that just have these like backgrounds where like your daddy didn't love you enough, so so you confuse attention for affection, even if it's abusive attention. Well, if he's giving me attention, that means he must love me. Like, it's not a love spell y'all need. It's to get some mental help and to leave that guy. But some people, they're not going to see that. But just being in these groups, for a while, it came like to realize like they'll do like a candle spell, they'll do like a jar spell, and they want like somebody to interpret the wax. And I'm sitting there, I'm looking at this one pink candle. I'm like, oh well, I see vulvas, I see pregnant women. You're going to be pregnant. 2 weeks later, she's like, everybody said that they saw pregnancy. I'm pregnant. I'm like, yeah, but was it really prophetic? Because understanding the how most people in these spiritual backgrounds work, you're probably already sleeping with the guy. So like, the
And
likelihood is
already
you're,
looking to be pregnant, it seems.
yeah. And like, so was it the fact that there's something prophetic about it, or is it just some common sense? Because you're using a red candle. What is the color red associated with in candle work? Well, it's associated with love, and sexuality. You got roses, you got rose quartz, you have all these things. Like, it ain't that hard to figure out, where you are or what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And like, when I was experimenting with them, like, okay, well, I went and I interpreted it for you. Come back and tell me whether or not my interpretation was right. They never did it. The few times that I have done readings, that somebody would come back confirmation, I never felt like there's anything really specific about what I said to them. It seemed more just common sense and just rolling whatever came from like the back of right off the top, whatever just popped in my head, and just rolling with that. And people are like, yeah, that seemed really accurate. I'm like, but was it? There was only one case that caught my attention. It was a woman. She burnt a black candle, and she just asked people, what do you see? And everybody's like, we see black hooded figures. And I'm looking at it, and it was just like a pillar candle, like a tapper candle, I guess. Can't really make out which one because it's all melted. But I'm like, okay, here the top of it, I see two figures that look like they're wrapped around each other, so I think they're making love. I think that's an affair. And I see the two puddles of wax on the left and right hand side look like two figures that are covering their face and walking away, out of shame for that relationship. For the affair. And I see like this little figure down the bottom. I have the picture on my phone. I can send it to you if you were interested. And I'm like, I see some sort of like rectification or justice for the person that was cheated on. And everybody else you would just say thank you to, but I was the only person that she came back to and said there was an affair that took place. But that was it. I'm not necessarily going to go as that with being, confirmation of anything, supernatural, because again, black candle, there's a limited number of things that people use a black candle for. And there's a likelihood that it's more about a breakup spell or a sour jar spell than it is for a cleansing ritual or whatever. She got lemons, she got peppers, she has glitter. So like all these things tell me like she's mad at somebody, like, so like, is there anything really, significant about that? Like, at best it's inconclusive. At best is like, no, it's just common sense stuff.
So think about this, one of the arguments that creationists have against evolution is that evolution is supposedly random.
Yeah, it's not.
They ignore the passages of the Bible about how the earth brought forth this and that, and so they know that it has to be literally the other parts of the story where God was said abracadabra and made poof, and then that happened that way, because it has to be a predetermined purpose. God can't orchestrate evolution because evolution is random, and that's their argument with it. But look at the lottery. The lottery is designed to be as random as it is possible to be. And if somebody wins the lottery, they think that God blessed them. It's completely random, but God blessed them. And now look at tarot cards, at the tea leaves, casting the chicken entrails, or what have you. All of these things are completely random, again. And it's just how you interpret or how you sell the bullshit story because only the person who spilled the tea leaves knows how to read the tea leaves, or the chicken bones, or the entrails.
Yeah.
I forget but they're all supposed to be completely random, and that's what makes them somehow messages from that deity.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I'm always been sitting there, like, okay, well, maybe Jesus is not real, but maybe there is some sort of God or some sort of spirit out there, that fills that role. I'm like, well, if there is something out there, well, I'd like to have a conversation at the very least, just to get some sense of like what the heck's going on here. Because as far as I know, like most things are happening just because for the sake of happening. Emil, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. He was a philosopher from France, I believe France. But, he says, like, history is ultimately the byproduct of our fear of boredom, which I look at it, I'm like, well, for all the wacky ass stuff that I see people doing to themselves just because they don't, it's like people just have this continuous need to have something happening. Like people hate being in their own mind. People hate spending time with themselves. So any amount of drama is better, seems to be better than no drama. But like no experience ever. It even under the influence of psychedelics, the few experiences that I have had is like, it's up to you. At the end of the day, is like you give yourself your own meaning at the end of the day. Like what you make out of your life is like what you're going to get out of it. And like looking at the subject of like non-duality and Christianity, like the alleged claim that Jesus was using psychedelics and that he was trying to point people to that perspective, when he said, the kingdom of, when the Pharisees come up to him like, well, where can the kingdom of heaven be seen? Jesus like, beware of those say it's here or there, because it's something that comes from within. But so even in that, so for a little bit, I'm open to like, well, maybe that has validity to the origin of Jesus, whatever. But even
My
in that,
thought is, I used to work for a corporation, and I worked for 14 years in a corporate office, one of those giant cube farm kind of things. And when you work in an environment like that, one of the things that you frequently encounter are meetings of all different types that are supposed to improve productivity and efficiency. And I'm just thinking, if there was a God who's the ultimate CEO of everything, how come there's never been a meeting to
yeah,
improve the efficiency? Why do we have 30,000 different versions of Christianity, and then that's just one of several different religions? And there's as many different versions of that as there are believers, and nobody knows a fucking thing that they all pretend to be absolute truth. Why has there been no meeting? Why has there been no memo? Why is there no clarification? And then it doesn't help when you read the scriptures, because when you read the Quran, it says that God keeps sending messengers, but then nobody believes him, so he kills everybody and then sends another messenger to somebody else. Well, there's a God who's utterly incompetent.
yeah, no, that's just insanity. Like if it hasn't worked the first 1,000 times, why are you going to continue on down that path? And so like that's my thing, is like I'm sitting there when I was a Christian, I'm sitting there, I'm talking with a family member, I'm like, there's too many issues within the church. You go to this church, they say one thing. You go to this other church, they say something else. Or maybe they mostly say the same thing because they're the same denomination, but this other denominations preaches something totally different. And there's multiple times within the New Testament where at the very least Paul is like, there's divisions amongst you, there's like heresies amongst you. That's why people, you allowing these heresies in, and you allow people to partake in communion, and that's why so many of you are sick and asleep and dying and whatever. And I'm like, like the New Testament's clear, like you guys have to have some amount of coordination or agreement as to what's being said. But anytime somebody brings that up, it's like, oh, well, you're just being a troublemaker. You're just trying to create division, blah, blah, blah. And maybe they try accusing you, oh, well, you just want to be a lazy Christian, or you just don't want to go to church. I'm like, no, like this is like, you have Calvinists that say that anybody who uses the gift of tongues or the gift of visions is demon possessed and is communing with the devil. But like, if they're wrong, Jesus says, he who commits like any man that is guilty of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven in this world nor in the world to come. So that's an unforgivable sin. And the Bible says like you're allowing these kind of people to partake of communion with you, and that's why so many of you are diabetic and have cancer and whatever. Like you guys want to say that that's not an issue to be, brought up and discussed. Like If they went out of their way to have this giant meeting as to which books should be allowed and which books shouldn't be allowed, which says that, God needs man to preserve his word. He's not able to do it for himself, whatever. Um, so there goes that scripture to begin with. But even if that is how God preserves his word, I think we're long past due for another revision of the Bible. Because I'm sitting there, I'm reading it, I'm like reading the book of Deuteronomy, and it's saying a woman who is neither married betrothed, if she's out in the field and a man lays hold of her and lays with her, then she has to be his wife. I'm like, there is not one decent father in America that I think, even as a Christian, would sit there and say that this scripture is of God. If there is a God that Christians proclaim that is just, that is all loving, compassionate, he would never allow for that. But you guys want to sit there and say you have to either accept all of it or none of it, because that's what Jesus allegedly said, even though Jesus never wrote for himself. But you can't bring that up either. I'm like, so then what can you talk about? Like, at least when it comes to my friends who are spiritualists, you can have a discussion, and if there does seem to be a discrepancy, they're open to discussing that, and there's much less hostility that I get from them. I'm like, well, that's not one of the fruits of the Holy Spirit. You're supposed to be like kind, patient, gentle, blah, blah, blah. But all you get is like, give it 30 minutes and they're fighting amongst themselves even. I'm like, well, definitely got to be some sort of demonic spirit behind the church, if there is such spirits.
Yeah.
I don't know, like, I guess for me it's just more like I'm just wanting to talk with different people. I have like one family member who's an atheist, but it's really difficult to get him to have these kind of conversations. He's just really not wanting to have conversations about religion, the impact that it makes. Anything other than that, he's open to discussing. And I was thinking like, okay, well, this here's an individual that's kind of gone down that path from kind of Christian to spiritual to atheist, like asking them, what their experience is with that, and to see how comparable that is, if there could be guidance from that. Because we know that, there's so many people in America that are going through that have to practice some sort of faith in secret. Like, even if you're not an atheist, listening to an atheist, who's grown up in, and not just Christian, but whether Muslim, whether Hindu, the type of things that they have to endure in spite of their God allegedly being, their family's God allegedly being of love. It's definitely something that can help a person kind of work with that, especially if you just left Christianity behind. Because I definitely, don't think there's enough of that kind of content out there for people to like get exposed to. Like, you're not the only person that's gone through this,
Yeah, the first call center environment I ever worked in, there was a girl. There was a obvious hardcore punk rocker. Just everything about the hairstyle and the everything about. Just go back to the like early 1990s and think hardcore punker. And that was this girl. She was also one of the first atheists that I'd ever met that openly identified as atheist, because most people who didn't believe in a God would always identify as something else.
Yeah.
They wouldn't even identify as Christian. I don't believe in a God, but I'm Methodist or whatever. That a lot of people did that. So this girl told me that she was atheist, and I asked her if she'd ever read the Bible. She laughed and she said, "Of course not." And I was like, "Well, how can you be an atheist if you haven't read the Bible? How can you be a proper atheist if you haven't read the Bible?" Because I always thought that was the first thing you had to do to be an atheist, was to read the damn Bible.
It's fun. Go ahead. Go ahead.
And she said that why should I waste my time reading this obvious fairy tale? Everything she knows about it is wrong, or it shows that it's wrong. And so, yeah, I guess you're right. So not just because they're an atheist doesn't mean they're an atheist activist, doesn't mean that they're interested in science or philosophy or theology or any of that shit. As a matter of fact, I've met a few atheists since then who are pretty much apatheists. They want to get about their lives, and they don't want to talk about this. Talking about theology and religion is as pointless to them as us discussing the value of the recent release of Kong versus Godzilla.
Yeah. I'm just like, I want to go see that movie, but I feel like realistically Godzilla would win that debate.
It's
I
so
found
dumb.
I'm in
It's
like
so
so many.
dumb.
Dude, a Godzilla, like in the classic Godzilla, his atomic breath is so powerful, it can launch him like from one continent to the next, or at least from one end of Japan, end of the Japanese
Oh,
islands
in
down to
this
the other end.
in this movie, it can bore 4,000 feet down through solid
Yeah,
rock in a minute.
but
That's
you
what
think that a
atomic breath can
gorilla
do.
is going to beat him? Like, what's he going to block that kind of what's he going to block that kind of like
I don't
radiation
want to
with?
talk about that movie. It was just so damn. I'm
But
a
I was
huge
in.
Godzilla fan. I've always loved
I
Godzilla.
love Godzilla.
Godzilla was my hero when I was a kid. As an
Yeah.
adult, I've got a bunch of Godzilla posters and T-shirts and stuff. I love Godzilla.
So
However,
like,
that movie's never been done right, never going to be done right. Every one of them is
no.
stupid. But this last one is easily among the worst. I'm not even kidding. It was just so damn dumb.
I want to see it maybe just to see if the fight scenes are entertaining, but honestly, I think I'm going to probably end up hating on it.
Well,
But
you're
like,
going to
I'm
hate
in
it
all
for
these.
reasons you don't suspect yet.
Oh, Jesus. Hey, because I know like the commercials only play the best clips. Like, that's why I avoid commercials for movies, is because by the time the movie comes out, I've already seen like 9 minutes of it, which if the average movie being 45 minutes to an hour, like 9 minutes is a large clip. I mean, it's a large chunk of it, and it's all the highlights. That's why the Simpsons movie was boring to me, because like, oh, I already saw all the humorous parts, and I was like 12 when that came out. So if I'm realizing at the age of 12, like, I'm gonna wait.
Yeah.
But I'm in all these like nihilist, like atheist
Shut up,
groups,
dog.
and one of them,
Shut up.
like they're all heavy, amusing. Um, so so all of them were like, one of them had this meme like when atheists realize that Godzilla is a god, and they sit there and smash their TV, and I reply and comment like when Christians realize that God is a Zilla. uh but like, so that's eventually like where my path went down. Like, the new age movement wasn't doing it for me. I found too many errors. Like, you're supposed to be upholding and like promoting these different cultures, but everybody that practices those religions you claim to uphold says that you guys are making a joke out of them. So clearly there's issues there. So I start listening to Alan Watts. That gets me into Taoism and the idea of like non-duality. I don't really get into the esoteric aspect of like these different Eastern religions. I think it gets a little over the top and way too crazy
Yeah,
doing that.
I think Taoism doesn't quite count as a religion on its
Yeah,
own.
no, definitely not.
Yeah, I know that Jedi is a religion, but Jedi is based on a combination
Of
of Taoism and Confucianism.
yes. But I liked the idea of non-duality. It was really a major change in a challenge to my perception as to like, because Christianity is so heavily, pushing on this idea that God and his creation are alien to each other. But I'm an artist. I draw tessellations, I draw mandalas. That's been a hobby for me, and I've become like, for somebody that I've never been taught how to do, I've been having to teach myself. I think it's come out really well. I have a handful of friends that are writers, one of whom is published and is really well known, or fairly well known, I guess. Um, and I'm sitting there talking with him, like, in my perception, whenever you create something, that's a reflection of you. That's a part of you. So when I look at, God, when I look at as Christianity portrays them, if there's flaw to be found within the creation, it's only a reflection of the greater flaw within its creator. You can't sit there and claim that when you create something that's somehow separate and alien to you, that's an expression of yourself. The one question, I don't got a problem with them. Maybe if we end up publishing this and somebody out there watching it has a problem, I guess, at least for your end, it's like a little bit more professional, but I got no problem with dogs. But so if I was like, yeah, like that doesn't make sense to me. The one question my friend would ask me is like, if man was made in the image and likeness of God, what does that say for man? Or if God made us in his image and likeness, then what does that say for him? or maybe the way he worded it was in reverse, but either way, like, it was to kind of get me questioning that and looking at it like, is man really separate from God? And I'm like, and then I was listening to Alan Watts, he was saying like, no, when Jesus was saying like, he who has seen me has seen the Father, he wasn't really talking about himself. Like, when you go with the idea that God, like when it says like the breath of life or the spirit of life, depending on which definition of Rawak you want to go with, because we know that the word for spirit, same word as breath. So either way, it's like either God was using like a literal piece of his breath or a portion of his spirit to turn man into a living soul, and like, so therefore a portion of your soul is a portion of God. And like, so when Jesus was saying he was seeing me as seeing the Father, he was going from like an idea of having experienced ego death or ego dissolution. And so when he's referring to himself, he's not referring to himself as we would perceive him, but to like some higher singular consciousness having become, self-aware that, duality is an illusion, whatever. So like I sat there with that, philosophy for a good while, but then I kind of came to realize like, I don't think that's where Taoism is meant to stop at. I think the when they are talking about having this higher understanding of the nature of the way the Tao and the yin and the yang and work with each other, all of them are equally real and also equally illusion. Because from that perception, the Tao expresses itself through duality. You can't have knowledge of self without other. Therefore, the dualism and non-dualism are both equally real. And I'm like, but I'm sitting there, I'm thinking about it. I'm like, the whole idea behind Taoism and Zen Buddhism is just to get a person to stop, asking questions and to just start observing the world around them for what it is. I'm like, maybe people just kind of went over the top with it. And like, it was just kind of more an idea, like, I don't know.
When I
Like,
was into
go
New
ahead.
Age spiritualism, I really liked the Tao Te Ching because I fancied myself a Jedi only because I heard Obi-Wan Kenobi before reading the Tao Te Ching. Had I read the Tao Te Ching before, I would have called myself a Taoist. My favorite line out of that, and I don't remember anything else in the book, but I remember this vividly, that nature acts without intent, and so
Mm-hmm.
cannot be said to be benevolent nor malevolent to anything. And where most religious believers, when they want to imagine that everything happens for a reason and that they exist for a purpose and everything, that might be an abhorrent thought to them. But I found it quite endearing.
Yeah.
That nature is what it is. You don't get any breaks. There's no do-overs. So this is just the reality.
Yeah. And that was what I was getting from Taoism is just, you know, like even like in Judaism and in the Old Testament where God says, I create the day, I create the night, I create good and I create evil. In the Kabbalah,
Isaiah
it describes,
45, 5, 6, and 7.
yeah. So in the Kabbalah, it describes God, as also being like male. You get this very dualistic, depiction of God within the Kabbalah. And even like from what I understand, the depiction of Bahamut was originally created by correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it was originally created by the Jesuit priesthood as a depiction of opposites. And it wasn't until the Spanish Inquisition came along that it started being associated with like devil, like with Satan worship, whatever. So,
Yeah, I'm
you
afraid
know,
I'm not that versed on demonology. I should be, but I'm not.
I just found it interesting. Like, there's this whole entire, and it goes back to like, well, what the Gnostics and other iterations of Christianity that were trying to embrace that idea. There's even a version of Islam. It's not. It's I think it's like one of the least practiced versions of it. But there's this version of Islam where like not where God is the only thing that exists. So even we don't exist, that we're just these expressions of God. But like the
Yeah,
existence itself, I'm like, but now I'm sitting there, I'm looking at that, I'm like, the less questions I mean, like if I want to understand how the only questions that I can ask, I can ever get an answer for is how things happen naturally. So when it comes to questions about spirituality, about, is there an afterlife, whatever, outside of my experiences with psychedelics, which I'm finally coming around to, like, those aren't real. That's just my mind being high on drugs, with my sensory input being ramped up by like the power of 10, causing, those type of experiences. Because like one of the reality checks I would do on LSD was like, because like the idea is that spiritualists throw out there, if you raise your consciousness, you can walk on water like Jesus. You can perform these miracles. So I'm sitting, like, LSD is supposed to raise your consciousness. So I'm sitting there, I'm like, well, if that's the case, then while I'm under the influence of the substance, I should be able to bend this wooden pencil. And if this wooden pencil doesn't bend like rubber, then it's all just in my head. So that became my reality check for that, which kind of got me to the realization, like, outside
the mistake that you made was in assuming that there was a spoon.
Well, that's where you get into like different, like philosophical existentialism or material existentialism. The spoon is only it's only a spoon when you use it as a spoon. So I'm trying to take on more of a naturalist perception of Taoism, where there's the mental aspect, but then there's the physical aspect, and the mental aspect is just more how you choose to look at something based on need, based on like what your priorities are. Because that's the big hallmark of human evolution, is that our way of looking at things are like based on necessity, based on innovation. So if we find a use for something, we associate, she is beautiful, she or he?
He.
He is beautiful.
Thank you. This is my Great Pyrenees Falcor.
So like, and again, going back to that, like, even if this is a simulation, if I walk out in a car and that car doesn't kill me instantaneously, it's going to be a hellish, the rest of my life is going to be hellish. Therefore, that idea, like, it's all mental, and I can't, no matter how much willpower I throw out there, seem to change it, or at least not how it is that I want to change it, that kind of disproves to me the idea of like, you can perform miracles if you simply have this great enough experience or enlightenment. Like, my idea of enlightenment at this point is just learn to kind of see things from a non-bias without, getting too emotionally attached to your situation. Like, I talk with people, I'm like, enlightenment is to walk wherever your feet blindly lead you. The moment you ask, where am I going? That's when you become lost. Yet, to make it more of a koan, to get you to stop thinking about it, is like, you're not really on an adventure unless you're lost. And then you could but then that goes through the process of going to the realization, well, it's not really so much as lost, you trying to find your way home. It's about the process kind of realize that anywhere can be home.
Like, if you're at peace. Of Apocalypse Now and Dennis Hopper's character, when he's like, man, it's like sometimes he just blows your mind. Like, did you know, yesterday, man, he told me that, did you know that if is the middle word in life?
Dude, I'm gonna be like, I was a little bit nervous about, like, because like so many of your videos seem like fairly like a bit of satire in there, so I wasn't sure exactly like how your personality was going to be. But when I watched a couple of your interviews with different people, like, it totally, like, dude, this guy's going to be a blast to talk with. Like, your sense of humor is really enjoyable. But like, and like your ability, like, to pull out references and like keep, rolling with like jokes, it's so much of a better conversation that you can get with like a creationist. And the amount of open-mindedness that you get from any other, from a different, spiritual minority, spiritual out. When I say minority, I mean based on like the number of people that practice it, not based on culture. Just because somebody might take that out of context. Hopefully won't. But when you talk to somebody that's like a pagan or a Wiccan or whatever, or an atheist, it's so much easier usually to have a conversation with them. And well, unless you're doing it online where everybody's, just wants to fucking pull a gun out on your head. It's like, if you don't agree with me, then even if you agree on everything else.
You meet people in real life that will be horrific trolls, but when you meet them in real life, then they know how to compose themselves.
Oh yeah, they don't want to confront a person. They get a kick out of it. I'm like, I sit there, tell people, like, stop feeding into these people. Like, you don't even know them. They're just a voice on the internet. But I'm guilty of doing the same. And it's but I understand it too. Like when you're saying there, you're having a conversation or you're giving a lecture, and a little bit of satire comes out because somebody in your position, especially with your involvement in politics in the state of Texas, reminding you the state why separation church and state is beneficial for everyone, including the religious population. Or when you're going to all these different events and you're having to deal with creationists like Kent Hovind or his son, whatever. Whenever you go to the Ark Museum, do you guys still do that annually or?
Well, COVID, obviously.
Oh, COVID, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Disrupted a bunch of my plans.
yeah, it's disrupted everybody's plans. Which I mean, I'm kind of curious on how things are going to happen after COVID-19. I mean, once more people are vaccinated, it's no longer.
I'm wondering if there's going to be an after COVID, because now they're talking about that there's a new strain the UK strain is now the most dominant in the United States, and it's a more contagious, which means that if we don't have the way that you handle something like this, you get everybody vaccinated as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And if we don't do that, I mean, if you don't immediately do the social distancing and the masking and shut down everything, I mean, for a number of weeks right away, we could have solved this a month. We could have solved this in a month.
Yeah.
The first one came over to the country. But everybody in the world would have had to have been on board with this.
Yeah.
You got to have everybody doing it at the same time. But if you don't, evolution happens. And then you get new strains to where the vaccinations that you might have come up with. Maybe we've got 3 different vaccinations. That's nice. But then what happens when we get a new strain that gets past it?
Mm-hmm. And I find it like with so many people, like the new conspiracy. I don't know how long it's been out now, but my grandmother listens to all these like different conspiracy theorists. I used to be really deep with the conspiracy. I used to be really, really deep. Again, like when my father, for the 7 years I lived with him, for like 5 of them. Not just Kent Hovind, but like Alex Jones and all these other different, right-wing conspiracy theorists, whatever. So I used to buy into that. But then there was like one point, and I was just talking about it, what got me out from conspiracy theories was I had this moment where like, what if the people that these conspiracy theories are supposed to be exposing are the ones that are making up these conspiracy theories just to misinform people, so you guys have no idea what's happening. And certainly I think with after the whole Trump election, that half of these false prophets, whatever, not one of them, they're saying like some of them, there's this one lady, I think you might have showed her on one of your videos at one point, but she has like pink hair. She's an older lady. She constantly tries to control the weather. There's before I lose train of thought, there's a YouTube channel called Fighting for the Faith, and this guy is a Christian whose channel is dedicated to exposing the charismatic movement, which I find completely hilarious, just watching another religious person tear apart other religious people that claim to be like faith healers or whatever. Just like, dude, if one of your own brothers or sisters in the faith, quote unquote, are calling out bullshit, like what more do you need, in that regard? And I find it interesting on that end. But I'm
gonna have to bail here shortly.
Oh yeah, no, my apologies. I don't know, like I wish my thoughts were more organized than what they were right now.
Well, I think you've been pretty lucid. I mean, you been at it for an hour. You did almost all the talking, and it was fluid.
I apologize. I was wanting more. I know that I just interrupted.
You don't need to apologize. As I said, you were fluid. There was very, very few times when you're like searching for the next thing to say. You were on top of it the whole time. So
I just don't like feeling like I'm taking up the whole conversation. I'm letting the other person speak, which I don't think
that's what I do. So that's what I'm trying not to do.
Oh Jesus, we're both doing the same thing, because I know that I get on it. I know, like, especially like if I like, because here in New York, weed's legal now. So finally, I never thought it was going to end up happening, but with all the stuff going on with Cuomo and the state being out of tax money, it makes sense that they would do that this year.
Yeah.
So like I know, like if like whenever I would have a couple of drinks or I smoke, that I might ramble more than what I should like to. So I'm just like overly self-aware about it. So there's this thought experiment that I've had for a while, and like have you ever listened to the I apologize if I get the name wrong, Isaac Asimov Memorial Debates.
No, I haven't.
So they're hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they're done annually. And the setup is like the kind of conversation that you would expect or might have if a group of physicists met at a bar. And so they get like 5 or 6 different physicists, maybe a couple of people who are like doctors or philosophers, whatever, and they get them together. They talk about different discussions. And the one in 2013 was on the nature of nothingness. And one thing, like, so I'm sitting there, and like one of my experiences with psychedelics was like, what if like we had the idea of nothingness, like something coming from nothing, which they discussed, like, they did discuss in this, like, what if the universe is just never had a beginning, but every time it comes to an end, there's a certain point within its in its early state of existence that it goes back to, and it picks back from there and carries on forwards in this loop. That was what one of the physicists suggested. Everybody else is kind of ripping on him for it, whatever, but like not as if, they're being dismissive, but like it's kind of humorous. Like, yeah, but you didn't explain where it came from. It's like, no, all we can explain is like it goes on and on in this loop of sorts. So my idea on nothingness, was like, and I hate bringing out pseudoscience. Are you familiar with Schrodinger's cat?
Yeah.
Okay, so like if we do end up publishing it, for people that don't know what Schrodinger's cat, it's a thought experiment about a cat in a box with a vial of poison. At some point, unbeknown to the person, because the box you can't see within it, it's going to fall in the cat, but you don't know what time, and either the cat is alive or dead, in accordance to traditional physics. If you're check up on it at any moment, traditional physics says it's in a superposition of both. So going back to where we're saying that consciousness doesn't, manifest the world around us, that it's just a benefactor for whatever mechanism it is that turns things from the realm of probability into the realm of reality when it comes to the wave function manifesting itself. I hate doing it, but like my idea of like, what if we're looking at the idea of nothingness completely wrong? Because we live in a world of substance, so we'd be thinking that nothingness is the antithesis, if that's the right word, of substance. So I'm like, I was saying there, like, okay, what if, okay, so like a state of nothingness, and Neil deGrasse Tyson on his podcast Star Talk talks about this. In a state of absolute nothingness, there wouldn't be even energy, no atoms, no molecules, no subatomic
particles. No distance.
There's no physics.
Yeah.
And when I look at physics, I'm not a physicist, I don't have a degree, but my understanding of it is that quantum physics is an expression of how subatomic particles behave and function. It's not, physics are separate from atoms. They're an expression of how atoms and subatomic particles interact with each other and express themselves. So in a state of nothingness, there's nothing there to say what can and cannot happen, because those are all rules or laws governed by quantum physics. It seems natural to me that that therefore, if there's nothing there to say what cannot happen, anything is possible. So the next logical thing to happen is that nothingness, well, in order for it to be a state of nothingness, there can't be anything there, yet there has to be something there to observe that nothingness, so which would create a paradox unless nothingness is it measures itself. It's a self-defined thing, which turns it from being nothingness to singularity, which is, when, creationists say like, oh, well, how can something come from absolute nothing? So like using that as an example of like, well, your definition of nothingness is wrong. And then for my thought is like, well, that's basically, if it's self-defining, that's being self-aware. We have the singularity. And I have this like expression, like when I'm talking with people about it, like when self reflects upon self, there arises the need for other. If nothingness, knowing that it's nothingness, there inherently arises the idea of something, that there could be something other than nothing. And therefore, having the realization, it would long for there to be something other than nothing, but it is all that there is. So this world exists as a simulation of what there could be if there was something other than nothing, serving both as a way for it to escape from its singular non-existence, as well as experiencing what there could be. But inherently, when the universe comes to its end and it returns back to a state of nothingness, it wakes back up to have a better understanding of what it means to be nothing, because it had this experience of having been something. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying like there aren't errors with it. but that was that's a thought that I like to throw out there, and like I like exploring in how other people what getting other people's feedback on that thought.
All right, I am going to have to go.
Okay, I apologize. That last ramble. No, this has been really good talking with you. So thank you for that.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm not good with the philosophy though, because I mean, while some people, I'm sure, I've talked to people who just find that absolutely fascinating, and it just causes my eyes to roll into my head, gazing into my own navel. Like
Yeah.
that.
For me, I came to realize, like, if I can't debate with a Christian based on science and actual facts, because they're always going to ignore it, then debating philosophy seems to be the next best place to go to. If they're not going to listen to scientific data, then here's a theoretical, a hypothetical idea for you to toy around with.
Philosophy either, but what they retort with is philosophy that is just it's bad. It's bad philosophy, and then it's also when you, I mean, when the ideas that they have that they think are so fascinating, that they think are possibilities, that they think they're thinking. It's like when you get into that thing when you're stoned and you're thinking about the atoms in your fingernail. That's what all of those arguments end up being for me. I'm like, oh, okay, this is your first time getting high.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it's panned out for me. And in studying philosophy, I've come down, I lean more and more towards nihilism, absurdism, and so on. And like through studying that philosophy, I kind of came to realize all of it's bullshit. At the end of the day, even, nihilism should definitely be quick to embrace that even nihilistic philosophy is bullshit, because well, if there is no inherent meaning or purpose to anything, then any search for explanation is meaningless.
No,
and I guess the only meaning that
as I understood it, a nihilist explained to me that I'm actually a nihilist, because I never thought I was.
Yeah.
But he says, but the nihilism was just that you don't believe that there is a purpose that is arbitrarily and externally imposed upon you.
Yes.
Doesn't mean that nothing means anything. It means that if there's a meaning of life, it wasn't put on you. It's for you to decide.
Well, the way I look at it is like people aren't looking for a meaning in life. I forget who it is that said that, but like what we're looking for is moments that make us feel alive. And so like that's, no matter how many questions about why we're here, you're never going to really get an answer for it. For me, that's always seen what like nihilism seems to lead to, is like there are no questions to why we're here. There is no purpose or reason. And, whatever reason you get for life, that should be what, comes from you or from yourself, and like souls, just to use the term, doing deep soul searching. It's like, how do I view myself in response to like, am I a good person? Am I doing enough for my community, for the environment, for those I care about at the very least? Yeah. And, but like, that's where I look at it. So that was my perception through nihilism, was just like, it's not to say, at the very least, because nihilism, helps a person embrace like that you can find meaning in meaninglessness. That is what gives it its value, where everything else, to maybe trying to say no value comes from relationship with God or whatever. I'm like, then where's God in any of this?
Yeah, I apologize, but I'm on the wire. I got to go.
Yep. Nope. Thank you for the conversation, and have a good one, sir.
Okay. Do you want me to publish it?
Yeah, if you want to, go ahead. If you feel comfortable with it, like it could be beneficial to somebody out there. But yeah. And like in the future, if you ever want to do this again, because like if I get more organized, write some ideas down, but that's up to you, because I know like you're really busy and all too. But yeah.
Right. I gotta run.
Have a good one. Yep.
Thank you much. Bye-bye.